There are stories we bury. Stories that live in the cracks of history books, in the spaces between what was written and what was lived. This is one of those stories. A story about what happens when one woman's body becomes a bargaining chip, a transaction, a cruel mathematics of survival. It began in 1857, on the Whitmore Plantation in Mississippi. 300 acres of cotton field stretching toward the horizon like an endless sea of white. Beautiful, if you didn't look too close. Beautiful, if you didn't count the cost measured in flesh and blood and stolen lives. The house stood at the center of it all. White columns reaching up toward a heaven that seemed to have forgotten this place. Inside those walls, wealth dripped from every chandelier, every velvet curtain, every piece of imported furniture that cost more than a human life. Because here, that calculation was made daily. Here, human beings were livestock, their worth determined by how much cotton they could pick, how many children they could bear to replenish the labor force. Among the enslaved was a young woman named Clara. I am 23 years old. Purchased at auction when she was 16, torn from her mother's arms and sold to the Whitmore estate to serve in the main house. They called her house girl, as if giving her captivity a softer name made it less brutal. As if serving meals instead of picking cotton made her less of a slave. Clara moved through the Whitmore mansion like a ghost. Silent. Watchful. Every morning before dawn, she lit fires in rooms she would never rest in. She pressed dresses she would never wear. She prepared meals she could barely taste, eating whatever scraps remained after the family finished. She had learned the rules of survival: keep your eyes down, your voice quiet, your thoughts hidden behind a mask of compliance. One wrong word, one perceived slight, could mean the whip. Or worse. But there was one person Clara could not hide from. Caroline Whitmore, the master's younger sister. 20 years old, pale as porcelain, fragile in ways that had nothing to do with physical strength. Caroline had been raised like an orchid in a hothouse, cultivated, protected, and ultimately too delicate for the world she was born into. She suffered from what the doctors called nervous disposition, a condition that left her bedridden for days, trembling at loud noises, unable to face the demands of Southern society. And Caroline had developed an attachment to Clara that went beyond the typical mistress-slave dynamic. In Caroline's isolation, Clara had become something between a servant, a confidant, and a living doll. Caroline spoke to Clara as if they were friends, as if the fundamental violence of their relationship could be erased by soft words and gentle treatment. She shared secrets. She wept on Clara's shoulder. She asked Clara's opinion on dresses and hairstyles as if Clara had any real choice in the matter, as if kindness could somehow balance the scales of ownership. Clara learned to navigate this strange territory. She learned to nod at the right moments, to smile when expected, to offer comfort while swallowing her own grief. Because kindness from a master could turn to cruelty in an instant. Because Caroline might treat her gently one day and sell her the next, and call both actions mercy. If you want to discover what happens next in this extraordinary true story from America's darkest chapter, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the shocking events that follow. Then, in the spring of 1857, everything changed. Josiah Blackwood arrived at the Whitmore Plantation. 35 years old, widower, owner of an even larger plantation 60 miles north. He had come to negotiate a marriage contract with Caroline. Not for love. Men like Josiah Blackwood did not marry for love. He needed a wife to manage his household, to bear legitimate heirs, to cement alliances between two powerful families. The engagement was arranged in a matter of weeks. Caroline went through the motions, the fittings, the preparations, the performative joy expected of a young bride. But Clara saw what others did not. She saw Caroline's hands trembling as she held her teacup. She saw the terror in Caroline's eyes when the wedding date was announced. She saw Caroline pacing her bedroom at night, wearing a path in the carpet, her breath coming in short gasps. 3 nights before the wedding, Caroline summoned Clara to her chambers after midnight. The room was dark except for a single oil lamp. Caroline sat on the edge of her bed in her nightgown, her face ghostly white, her eyes red from crying. What Caroline confessed that night would shatter Clara's world. Caroline could not go through with the marriage. Not the ceremony. She would stand at the altar, say the vows, accept the ring. But the wedding night. The consummation. The physical intimacy that would seal the marriage contract and produce the heirs Josiah expected. Caroline's fear of this act had consumed her entirely. The very thought sent her into fits of panic so severe she could not breathe. And so Caroline had devised a plan. A plan so monstrous in its casual cruelty that it could only be conceived by someone who had never questioned her right to use another human being as she saw fit. Clara would take Caroline's place on the wedding night. Clara would enter the darkened bedroom, her face obscured. Clara would submit to Josiah Blackwood in his marriage bed. And Caroline would maintain the fiction of consummation, secure the marriage, and avoid the trauma she could not face. Caroline presented this as if it were a favor. As if Clara should be grateful for the opportunity. As if being forced into the bed of a stranger was somehow preferable to picking cotton. As if Clara's body was simply another resource to be exploited, no different than the cotton fields or the horses in the stable. Clara stood frozen as Caroline explained the details. The timing. The darkness of the room. The silence Clara must maintain. And the implicit threat underneath every word. Refuse, and face consequences too terrible to name. Resist, and be sold south to the sugar plantations where life expectancy was measured in years. Speak of this to anyone, and watch everything she knew be destroyed. Clara had no choice. She had never had a choice. That was the arithmetic of enslavement. Every decision made under coercion, every yes extracted through the threat of violence. And so she agreed, because agreement was the only language available to her. The wedding took place on a Saturday afternoon in June. The Whitmore estate was transformed into something out of a fairy tale. Flowers imported from New Orleans, musicians brought in from Jackson, tables laden with food prepared by enslaved hands. 200 guests arrived in their finest clothes to witness the union of two great plantation families. Clara dressed Caroline that morning, lacing up the white silk gown, arranging the veil, pinning flowers in her hair. Caroline smiled and waved to her guests. She danced with her new husband. She cut the cake. She played her part flawlessly. And all the while, Clara watched from the shadows, knowing what was coming. As night fell, the guests departed. Josiah retired to the master bedroom that had been prepared for the wedding night. Caroline, pleading exhaustion and maiden nervousness, insisted on a moment alone to compose herself. The house fell silent. And then Clara was summoned. She moved through the darkened hallway like a woman walking to her own execution. She wore one of Caroline's nightgowns, her hair arranged to match Caroline's style. Her hands shook. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She entered the bedroom. The lamp had been dimmed to near darkness, as Caroline had arranged. Josiah was there, waiting, his face obscured by shadow. Clara said nothing. She could say nothing. Her voice would give her away. What happened next occurred in terrible silence. Clara closed her eyes and tried to disappear inside herself, tried to go somewhere else, anywhere else. She thought of her mother, sold away years ago. She thought of the songs the field workers sang at night. She thought of anything but the present moment. And then, suddenly, it was over. Josiah rose from the bed and crossed to the window, throwing open the curtains. Moonlight flooded the room. That was when he saw her face. That was when Josiah Blackwood realized he had not just consummated his marriage with Caroline Whitmore. He had been deceived. Manipulated. His wedding night, the sacred act meant to seal his marriage, had been a lie. Clara expected rage. She expected violence. She braced herself to be beaten, killed, to have every bone in her body broken for the crime of being used in this deception. But what happened was far stranger, and far more dangerous. Josiah stared at her for a long moment. And then he laughed. Not the laugh of a man amused, but the laugh of a man who had just seen through the entire rotten structure of the world he inhabited. He called for his manservant. He ordered the entire household assembled. The Whitmore family, the house slaves, everyone who remained on the estate. At 2 o'clock in the morning, they gathered in the main parlor, confused and frightened. And there, in front of everyone, Josiah Blackwood made an announcement that would send shockwaves through the plantation and everyone who lived there. He declared his marriage to Caroline Whitmore void. He declared Clara to be his true wife, his legal wife, regardless of the law that said enslaved people could not enter into marriage contracts. He freed Clara from bondage on the spot, signed documents of manumission before witnesses, and announced that she would return with him to his plantation not as a slave, but as the mistress of his household. The room erupted in chaos. Caroline collapsed. The Whitmore family screamed objections. The other enslaved people stared in disbelief at something that should have been impossible. A slave transformed into a free woman, elevated to a position of unimaginable power, all in the space of a single night. No one knew what had truly happened in that darkened bedroom. No one knew if this was madness, strategy, or something else entirely. But one thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. Now Clara stood at a crossroads between two impossible worlds. The journey to the Blackwood plantation took 3 days. Clara rode in the carriage beside Josiah, no longer in chains but not yet free in any meaningful sense. She wore Caroline's clothes, carried Caroline's trunk, inhabited a space that should not have existed for someone born into slavery. The other enslaved people who traveled with them stared at her with expressions she could not read. Resentment. Hope. Fear. Confusion. She represented something that broke every rule they had been taught about their place in the world. When they arrived at the Blackwood estate, Clara discovered a plantation twice the size of the Whitmore holdings. 400 enslaved people worked these fields. The main house rose up like a monument to wealth built on suffering. And she was expected to walk through its front door as its mistress. The white household staff refused to acknowledge her. The enslaved workers did not know how to speak to her. Was she one of them, elevated by some temporary madness that would end as suddenly as it began? Or was she truly something new, something that threatened the entire social order? Josiah made his intentions clear. He did not love Clara. He did not pretend affection. But he had been humiliated by the Whitmore deception, and his response was to embrace it fully, to turn the insult into a weapon. If Caroline Whitmore thought she could use an enslaved woman as a substitute, Josiah would make that enslaved woman into a wife, into a lady of society, into a living rebuke of the hypocrisy he saw everywhere around him. Clara began to understand that she had not escaped one trap, only traded it for another. Josiah expected her to play the role of wife in public. To dress in fine gowns, to entertain guests, to manage the household. But in private, she remained under his control, subject to his whims, dependent on his protection. Her freedom existed only as long as he chose to honor it. The white society of Mississippi reacted with fury. Neighboring plantation owners refused to visit. Churches condemned Josiah as a madman and a race traitor. There were threats, whispered plans to have Clara kidnapped and sold back into slavery, to have the manumission papers declared invalid. Josiah responded by hiring armed guards. He dared anyone to challenge his authority on his own land. He seemed to relish the scandal, to feed on the outrage. But Clara lived every day in terror. She knew how fragile her position was. She knew that one word from Josiah could return her to bondage. She knew that his death would leave her completely vulnerable, that his heirs would waste no time stripping away her freedom. And then she discovered she was pregnant. The child conceived on that terrible wedding night was growing inside her. A child who would be born legally free because of Josiah's declaration, but who would inherit none of the protections that white children took for granted. A child who would exist in the same impossible space Clara now inhabited, neither enslaved nor truly free. Meanwhile, back at the Whitmore plantation, Caroline had fallen into a complete collapse. The scandal had destroyed her reputation. No man would marry her now. Her family treated her as a burden, a source of shame. She had sacrificed Clara to avoid her own trauma, and the result had been her complete social annihilation. Some nights, Caroline thought about Clara. She told herself she had done Clara a favor, that freedom was worth any price. She could not admit, even to herself, that she had committed an act of violence as brutal as any overseer's whip. That she had used another human being's body to solve her own problem, and called it kindness. The plantation system that created this situation continued unchanged. The cotton was planted and harvested. The enslaved people woke before dawn and worked until dark. The masters counted their profits and told themselves they were civilized, that they were Christian, that they were generous to the people they held in bondage. But Clara's story had cracked something open. Word spread through the enslaved communities across 3 counties. They spoke of her in whispers, trying to understand what her transformation meant. Was it possible to escape? Was there a way out of the system that seemed eternal and inescapable? Or was Clara's story just another form of cruelty, a false hope that would lead only to more suffering? As Clara's pregnancy advanced, Josiah made another shocking decision. He announced that he would legally adopt the child as his heir. That this baby, born of a union that should never have occurred, would inherit the entire Blackwood fortune. His white relatives were apoplectic. They hired lawyers. They searched for ways to challenge his sanity, to have him declared incompetent. But Josiah was careful. He had documented everything. He had witnesses. And he had power. In a society where white men held absolute authority, he wielded his privilege like a weapon, forcing everyone around him to recognize Clara's freedom and their child's legitimacy. But power built on one man's whim is not safe. It is not justice. Clara understood this in her bones. She began to plan. Quietly, carefully, she started setting aside money. She made connections with free black communities in the North. She learned to read and write, skills that could get an enslaved person killed but that were merely eccentric for a white man's wife. She prepared for the day when Josiah's protection might disappear. When Clara gave birth, the baby girl she named Grace became the center of a legal and social storm that would eventually reach the courts. The Blackwood relatives filed suit to invalidate Josiah's adoption, to declare Grace illegitimate, to strip away the inheritance. The case dragged on for months, consuming resources, energy, and hope. But it also did something unexpected. It forced the courts to confront questions they preferred to ignore. What was the legal status of a formerly enslaved woman freed by private manumission? Could a white man legally adopt a child born to such a woman? What rights did that child possess? The answers to these questions would not come easy, and they would not come clean. But Clara had survived too much to give up now. She testified in court, the first formerly enslaved black woman to do so in that jurisdiction. She spoke of her life, her experience, her humanity. She forced the white men judging her to see her as a person, not property. And slowly, grudgingly, the legal system began to bend. Not break. The laws of slavery remained intact. The institution continued. But Clara won her case. Grace was declared Josiah's legal heir. The inheritance was secured. It was a tiny crack in an enormous wall, but it was a crack nonetheless. Years passed. The tensions that Clara's story represented would eventually explode into civil war. The entire system of slavery would be destroyed, not through individual acts of liberation like hers but through blood and fire and mass resistance. But Clara lived to see that day. She lived to see freedom come to the people who had stood in the fields watching her ride away in that carriage. She lived to see grace grow up in a world transformed, still unjust but no longer legally enslaved. Clara's story does not have a simple moral. She was not saved by kindness. She did not overcome through virtue. She survived through calculation, through understanding power, through being willing to use every tool available to her even when those tools were tainted by the same system that had enslaved her. She was both victim and survivor, both powerless and resourceful, both trapped and free. The plantation system that created her suffering was not an aberration. It was America. It was the foundation of wealth, the basis of power, the original sin that the nation has never fully confronted. And the echoes of that system persist in every inequality, every injustice, every moment when human beings are valued less than profit. Clara died in 1889, at the age of 55. Grace inherited the Blackwood fortune and used it to fund schools for formerly enslaved people. The plantation itself was eventually broken up and sold. The great house fell into disrepair. The cotton fields were reclaimed by wild growth. But the story remained. Passed down through generations, whispered in kitchens and churches, written in letters and diaries. A story about what one woman endured, what she survived, and what she built from the ruins of violence. This is not a story with easy answers. It is not a story of redemption or triumph. It is a story about the terrible choices forced upon people by an evil system, and about the stubborn human refusal to be completely destroyed even by the worst that history can inflict. It is a story we need to remember, not because it makes us feel good but because it tells us the truth. The truth about where we came from. The truth about what we are capable of, both the worst and the best. The truth about the cost of freedom, and about who has always paid that cost. There are stories we bury because they are too difficult, too painful, too revealing of the foundations upon which our world was built. But those are exactly the stories we must tell, again and again, until we finally learn what they have to teach us. This was Clara's story. One woman's journey through America's darkest chapter, and her refusal to let that darkness consume her completely. If this story moved you, if you believe these histories must be told and remembered, subscribe to this channel and share this documentary with others who need to hear it. The past only has power over us when we refuse to face it. By bearing witness to these stories, we honor those who survived and we commit ourselves to never allowing such injustices to occur again. Hit that subscribe button now and join us as we continue to uncover the untold stories of American history.